For my next interview, I have with me Paul Kester. He was a German child when the war broke out. He escaped Nazi Germany on the Kindertransport to Sweden. He had to leave his family and everything he knew behind. Here he is to tell us his amazing and impactful story. Where and when were you born?
I was born on the 14th of December 1925 in a town called Wiesbaden in West Germany, very close to Frankfurt. And what's the next question?
What was life like before the war?
Well, keep in mind I was born in 1925. My childhood was rather normal. We had a family of parents, grandparents. I had a sister who was 2 years older. My family had a large clothing store in town. We lived in an apartment. I started school at the age of 6 in 1932. In 1933 was the year that Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and the Nazi Party very quickly became the dominant party and took complete power. Its program was they declared the Germans to be a master race, that all other races were inferior, and the Jews being one of the most inferior races. Now I must say that in Germany at the time there were roughly 600,000 Jews among a German population of 65 million. And in Wiesbaden, the town where I lived, a town of about 300,000 citizens, there were 3,000 Jews, small community. What was life when you said before the war? It's actually, the war didn't start until 1939, so there were 6 years of my childhood that I lived in Germany under the Nazi regime. It didn't affect me so much. The first idea that things were different was that the Nazis put up big signs all over town that declared that the Jews were misfortune for Germany, that they were criminals and were accused of all sorts of crimes and misbehavior. And for me, at the age of 7, it was difficult to understand, because I knew that my parents, my family, were no criminals, and I also knew that the small number of Jews in Germany could not have caused the misfortune that they were accused of for the rest of Germany. It didn't make sense that 1% of the population could create chaos and terrible things for 99% of the remaining people. For the adults it was different. Jews were limited now, exercising certain professions. Businesses were impacted by new regulations, and there was a question of, should one leave Germany? Yes, I had 2 cousins. They were young, in their early 20s. One could no longer attend the university. The other one would no longer work in the business that had employed him. So they were unattached and decided to leave, trying to get to a country that was less hostile and less restrictive, and they were young enough to start building up a new life. For us, it was a much more difficult decision. Imagine having a family with small children, grandparents, still ongoing business, and a country where we could trace our ancestry back about 600 years, all living in West Germany. There was pretty much complete assimilation, other than the difference in religion. Socially, we were fully accepted, and to abandon all that, to try to get to another country, if a country wanted to accept you, and come to a country where you didn't speak the language, where you couldn't practice your profession or exercise your business. This was not a decision that was easily made, as long as living conditions under the Nazi regime in Germany were somewhat tolerable. But as the years progressed, yes, some of our friends left, and actually in 1938, now 5 years after the Nazis had come to power, my family wrote to some relatives we had in the United States asking for affidavits of support, which were needed in order to gain legal entry to this country. These relatives said they couldn't do it for the whole family, but they were willing to take one of the children. Now, my sister, being the older one, she was now 14, left Germany. My mother still took her to Hamburg, the German port, where she boarded a ship and alone traveled towards an unknown destination, leaving her family, her home and everything she was used to, but already quite conscious of the fact that she was leaving a country where a future was uncertain, and possibly endangered. My life continued that year. I still could travel freely, visiting during my summer vacation different relatives in different parts of Germany. Came back to school after summer vacation, engaged in the usual sport activities. We could freely go to the movies, which was quite popular. It was a new thing to do long before today's television and whatever else, other means of communication or entertainment that you presently have available. So, 12 years old, life was good, until one day in November of that year, and my friend Leo and I, we were in the same class in school, and listening to the lecture that the teacher presented, but then a school official entered the room and said that Leo and I should go home, that there were problems in town. Not knowing what he was talking about, we did as we were told. And I come home and I find my mother and my grandmother who lived with us very much upset. They, as every other morning, mid-morning, had intended to go to our store, which was about a 15-minute walk from our apartment. And they had to pass a synagogue and saw that it was in flames, and also that there was some upheaval, some people damaging some small Jewish stores that they encountered on their way. And my father had gone earlier to the store to open it up and found a large crowd in front. The store had many display windows, many glass cabinets, shelves, and all that was being smashed. Two policemen watched what was going on, but did not interfere, but asked my father to come with him. And trying to find their way through this crowd, he managed to sidestep and escape, because what had happened that day was the beginning of a government-organized major pogrom, later called Kristallnacht or Crystal Night. What happened that day, all synagogues, about 1,500 in Germany, were burned or destroyed. Still existing Jewish stores or institutions were vandalized and destroyed, put out of business. Now, it was no longer a question of should one emigrate, but it was obviously a signal that this was the beginning of the end of Jewish life in Germany. And what happened next, actually, after a couple of days, my father came back out of hiding. Supposedly, men were no longer arrested. But that evening, the doorbell to our apartment is ringing. I think it was 8 or 9 o'clock at night. A person, I opened it, a man in civilian clothing, identifies himself as a member of the secret police, what was called the Gestapo, and ordered my father to come with him. And within minutes he was gone. And my mother told me to get on my bike, go to the house of friends, warn them the arrests are still going on. I still did as I was told, and I recall that dismal November night. And what followed was, next thing, my mother and I go to police headquarters in Wiesbaden. Where's my father? No answer. Somehow, after a few days, we learned that he, with so many Jewish men, had been sent to a concentration camp by the name of Dachau in southern Germany. A concentration camp that existed throughout the years until its liberation by American troops at the end of the war. But yes, everybody tried to find out how to get away from Germany, where to go. The borders were closed, but, and this was all in a matter of days, all of a sudden England declares itself willing to take 10,000 children, Jewish children from Germany, and West European countries, France, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, also were willing to take a few. My mother puts my name on the list for each of these countries. But then After about 4 weeks, in early or middle December, my father returns. He had managed to withstand the hardship, the starvation, the mistreatment that they were exposed to at the concentration camp reasonably well, and he was always very strong physically, and did not seem to have suffered any severe physical or mental heart damage from those 4 weeks. And about the same time, we get a letter from a distant relative who is a teacher at a Jewish boarding school in Sweden. Sweden declared it's willing to take 500 Jewish children from Germany, and that school was to take 30 or 40 of those 500. His relative put my name on that list, and within days we get a letter from the Swedish embassy in Berlin stating that a permit was available for me to come to Sweden. That automatically removed my name from any list for any other country. And it was Sweden now was to be my destination. And ultimately my destiny. How to get there? To England, they had organized transports for the thousands of children that went there. Somehow we could not find out if anything like that was arranged for those of us who were allowed to come to Sweden. Well, my father found out that in one of the chemical factories outside of Wiesbaden, one of the German executives was an honorary consul for Sweden, and we got an audience, and we went there, and my father said, what should we do? Could he advise us how to get to Sweden? And the man said, put him on a train, get him out, quick. It was good advice. It was by now middle of, maybe around the 20th of December. My father and I still make some quick trips to visit relatives for me to say goodbye. And one of the last days of the year, my personal belongings are being packed and to be shipped to Sweden. This had to be done under the close supervision of a Nazi police official to make sure that I would not be able to take along anything newly acquired, anything of value that possibly could be converted to money in the country I was going to. And on the 9th of January, 1939, exactly 2 months after the start of the pogrom, I bid my parents farewell. I board a train in Wiesbaden. We exchanged farewells and expressed a hope for an early time to get reunited. And I now just had turned 13, traveled by train about a 7-hour ride from Wiesbaden to Berlin, stay with a cousin there. Next day we go to the Swedish embassy after some minor red tape. A couple of days later, I get the permit to enter Sweden, entered in my documents. And on the 15th of January of that year, 1939, still no war. I board a train in Berlin that carries me through northern Germany to the German port at the Baltic Sea, where the train gets on a ferry that carries the train from the North German port to southern Sweden across the Baltic. I'd never seen an ocean before, but now I did. And what do I remember of that last train ride through Germany? Well, Nazi official in his black uniform checks my little hand luggage and my papers. A last-minute gift, a book. He says I'm not allowed to take along. He takes it. I couldn't care less. Finally, in the afternoon, the train gets on a ferry, and the ferry starts moving. And I still remember like it was yesterday. I look out and I see the German coastline on a slightly foggy January afternoon, slowly disappearing on the horizon. And I had a tremendous sense of relief. Not that I had left the country where I was born and had grown up, not that I left my family behind, but aware that I was leaving a country where now it was a crime to be Jewish. I arrive at that Jewish school in southern Sweden. I join 60 other Jewish children from Germany, similar background as mine, and they become my new family. Over the years, we stayed in contact with many of them, both in this country and in Israel, in Sweden, England, France, wherever they wound up. As a matter of fact, one of the girls at that school, 10 years later, became my wife. What did I do in Sweden? Well, that particular school, keep in mind I got there in January of 1939. In September of that year, Germany invades Poland and the Second World War is starting. Now, that school had to be closed, and in 1940, I come to another children's home. I was under the auspices of the Jewish community of Stockholm. They financed our lives. I could start Swedish school, Swedish high school, for the next 2 years. And I was very happy that I still could do that, still continue in education. I was just borderline. I was 14. The kids who were 15 or older could no longer attend school but had to go to work on the farms or factories. The Swedish high school that I attended went up to age 16. I wanted to continue, but there was no money for me, and I managed to get to Stockholm. I was 16 now. Go to work in an office and enrolled in evening high school for the next 3 years, where I was able to complete my Swedish high school requirements. Now, how did I stay in contact with my family? We wrote letters every week. I wrote to them, they wrote to me. After the war started, these letters were censored by the Nazis, and if anything was written that reflected negatively on conditions in Germany or otherwise was found inappropriate in the judgment of the censor, they would black it out so everyone couldn't read it. Like heavy black ink. I still have those letters. Some years. Life for my family became progressively more difficult in Germany. And fortunately, Sweden was not, like the rest of Europe, occupied by Germany, but stayed neutral. That made it possible to maintain postal contact, that made it possible to have some kind of, to lead some kind of normal life. But also we were quite well informed what was happening in the world. We followed the events of the war. We were saddened by the collapse of Western Europe being run over by the Nazis. We admired and hoped that England would survive. Well, in 1942, shortly after America got into the war, we learned that Jews still remaining in Germany were being deported to German-occupied parts of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and my parents could write to me that in August of that year they had to leave Wiesbaden and were sent to a ghetto town called Theresienstadt, what is now the Czech Republic. It didn't think that we could stay in contact, but I tried to send them postcards separate to each member of the family, registered mail with return receipt, and again the Germans diligently observed international postal regulations, and within days I had my receipts back with my family's signatures and new address. A limited correspondence still could be maintained for the next few months, But in January of 1943, after they had been in that ghetto town for 5 months, my letters came back with a big stamp that the person to whom it was addressed was no longer there, but had departed. I knew that it meant bad news. We realized that Theresienstadt was sort of a transit camp. And later on I learned that my parents had been on the 23rd of January 1943 in a transport of 2,000 Jews from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz, where upon arrival all 2,000 were sent to the gas chambers and murdered. My grandmother stayed on another year, but died in Theresienstadt of living conditions not fit for survival. My life continued all right. Finally, the war in May of 1945 came to an end. I had a good life in Stockholm. I felt at home. But in 1946, barely 1 year after the end of the war, I managed to get on a trip to the United States only for a visit. I got reunited with my sister and other relatives and friends. I crossed the United States by Greyhound bus. I learned a lot about this country, but came back to Sweden where I felt at home. But in 1948, I decided to come to this country for good. My wife and I arrived in Los Angeles. You asked me, I think, if I ever went back. Mm-hmm. Yes, I did. As early as 1947 from Sweden. I had an uncle who was married to a Catholic lady. He was not deported at the same time as the rest of the Jews, not until early 1945, managed to survive a few months between the date of his deportation and the end of the war, and so did his family. I traveled to Germany several times. Each time uncomfortable and unwilling to deal with anyone of an age where I wouldn't know where had they been, what they had done. Until a new generation had grown up.
Well, thank you so much. It was very nice to hear your story. Your story was very meaningful, and thank you so much for having me.
I'm glad I could do this, and I'm curious what shows up on YouTube.